Welcome back, amazing fourth graders. It is time for social studies out of our Michigan Adventure textbook. Today's lesson is Chapter 5, Lesson 1. We are going into another war. It just seems like that's what we've been talking about for the last several lessons. Remember from last lesson, we now have an elected governor, Governor Stephen T. Mason, who happens to be called the boy governor because he was only 18 years old. Michigan has settled its war with Ohio. We have lost the city of Toledo, but we have gained the Upper Peninsula. And also, we have more and more people coming in to Michigan because of the Erie Canal. So we're going to read about what's happening in Michigan and what's happening in the United States that affects Michigan. Let's begin. Chapter 5, Lesson 1, Slavery and the Trouble That Followed. Our focus question is, how did slavery divide the country and lead it to war? The United States has always been famous as the home of the free. At first, we were not honest about this because we allowed slavery. Slavery is where we take away other people's rights to be free and to make their own decisions. They were treated as property. And you may or may not have remembered that from last year's Black History presentations. At the top, we see a $100 reward for a runaway, not spelled correctly, but for a runaway slave. They were asking for you to catch them, and they would give you $100 for catching a man. Imagine that. But remember, in the last chapter, we found out that when we became a state, Michigan was not going to allow slavery in here unless you had owned slaves before. We were going to be a free state. Let's find out what this happens in Michigan. No slaves here, but the Northwest Ordinance said slavery would be stopped in Michigan. Still, there were a few slaves here. By the year 1830, there were hardly any. Many people in Michigan knew that slavery was very wrong. Sadly, people in other parts of the country felt slavery was right. Most slaves were held in the southern states. Some people tried to have slavery outlawed. It was not easy. Slaves were treated like useful property. They were treated like animals or pieces of equipment like horses and plows. People would own people. Imagine that. And they would treat them like animals and sometimes even worse. Let's turn the page. Top of the page. Can't we stop it? During the 1830s, feelings against slavery increased. Many settlers in Michigan came from New York State. There had been little slavery in New York, so most people here felt slavery should be ended. In the year 1834, Canada, the country of Canada, our nearest neighbors, made slavery illegal. Now it was against the law to own a slave in that country. From time to time, slaves ran away. Before 1834, they had no place to go. Their owners would track them down wherever they went. Now, if a slave could only reach Canada, he or she was free. No one could come after them. Otherwise, that poster that we saw in the other page, they would offer people money to chase down runaway slaves. Middle of the page, Michigan, the way to freedom. Since Michigan is right next to Canada, our state became one pathway to freedom. There were those who wanted to help runaway slaves. If they saw an escaped slave family, they let them rest in their barn and gave them a meal. Sometimes they built secret rooms in their homes as hiding places. After a while, the slave helpers became more organized. They talked with one another. They planned stops along the way. They figured out ways to take slaves across the Detroit River and at other places. If we take a look to the right, we see that behind that clock was a secret hiding spot. Members of the Underground Railroad often hid escaped slaves in their homes and barns. Bottom of the page, the Underground Railroad. These slave helpers developed into a secret group. This group was secret because it was against the law to help escaped slaves. They were called the Underground Railroad. This group had let's turn the page. So boys and girls, they didn't have any trains, and it wasn't underground. They weren't digging tunnels. They weren't going and traveling on trains. However, each hiding place was called a station. That station might have been a home, a barn, a shack, somewhere where they could hide slaves and keep them safe. The helpers were called conductors, kind of like a train conductor. Slaves were moved, usually at night, from station to station in wagons. Many towns in Michigan had Underground Railroad stations. Look at the map and see if you can find your town. Not all towns with stations are shown. Even if it is not on a map, it may have had a station. So as we can see in the middle of the page, we see a map of Michigan and we see arrows with numbers. Those were stations along the Underground Railroad trails. Again, they weren't trains, they weren't underground, they were many, many miles of trails that escaped slaves would travel from station to station, stations being homes or barns, somewhere safe that they could hide, and they would travel at night. So if we take a look at the numbers here and we try to find Detroit, Michigan, there isn't a Hamtramck, but there is a Detroit, Michigan. Detroit is number 12. And if you take a look at the map and look at number 12, we can see that we were one of the last stations in order to get to Canada. Why? Because as we know, if we go to downtown Detroit and we look across the river, that is Canada. We are that close to another foreign country. We also went farther north into the Upper Peninsula to get into Canada that way. We also went through Port Huron to get to Canada through Sarnia. At the bottom of the page, Women Speak Out, Sojourner Truth. An ex-slave woman from New York moved to Battle Creek. Now, Battle Creek is number 18, around 18. And she was a tall, proud woman. Others imagined the pain of her being a slave. But this lady, she felt it. Let's turn the page. Here's her picture at the very top of the page. She traveled and spoke out against slavery. She was a powerful speaker and quite a friend of President Abraham Lincoln. Let's find out. Her real name was not Sojourner Truth, but Isabella Balmfree. She was probably named by her slave owners. In 1843, she changed her name and began to speak out against slavery. Now she was called herself Sojourner Truth. Sojourner means to travel. She told the truth about slavery. She didn't cover it up. She told people how awful it was. She told the truth about slavery, and once she even visited the President Lincoln at the White House. Sojourner Truth died in 1883. She was born a slave, but lived long enough to see the end of slavery. She is buried in Michigan at the Battle Creek Cemetery. Next important person, Laura Haviland, Another brave lady worked with the Underground Railroad. Her name was Laura Haviland. She lived in Adrian, Michigan. At first, Laura had a school which helped black children read and write. Even in Michigan, few African American children could go to school. Later, she helped escaped slaves when they reached Michigan. Still, Laura Haviland did not think this was enough. Finally, she traveled to the southern states. She planned ways to get slaves away from their owners. She did not wait for them to escape on their own. Slave owners were furious. They offered a reward of $3,000 if she could be found and stopped. But Laura Haviland was never caught by slave owners. So here's a woman with white skin who was a teacher who taught African American children to read and write, and the slave owners, offered a reward for her capture because she was getting slaves to be free. Interesting, isn't it? Let's turn the page. Boys and girls, the next several pages are a story about the Crosswhites. The Crosswhites were a family that were affected by slavery and by the Underground Railroad. Let's begin. The Crosswhite story in 1847. It was so nice to live in Marshall, Michigan. Lucretia Crosswhite was looking at all the wonderful things in the dry goods store. There were so many colors of cloth and thread. Her father, Adam, had sent her to buy some string. Even though she only needed string, Lucretia loved to look at everything. Since it was 1847, there were not many stores to visit. As Lucretia ran her finger along the pretty cloth, she heard the voice. A stranger was speaking to the storekeeper. The hairs on Lucretia's neck tingled. She had not heard a man speak that way since they lived in Kentucky. Was he from Kentucky? Suddenly, Lucretia forgot all about the string. She ran from the store toward home. Lucretia swung breathlessly through the front door of her house. Her mother grabbed her by her shoulders. "Lucretia, what is the matter, girl?" "Oh, Mama, I was in the dry goods store. I heard the man speak. I think he is from Kentucky. Perhaps he is looking for us." Her mother spoke quietly. "Now, Lucretia, do you not know that? Perhaps it means nothing at all. But, Mother, I am so worried. Please tell Father." "Of course I will. You know Father has told the neighbors he will shoot his gun in the air. It will be a warning. They will come to help if there is any trouble." Lucretia told her brothers and sisters, all four of them. The older ones understood. The younger ones were confused by her worry. Lucretia did not sleep well that night. She had nightmares. Several days later, Lucretia felt a little better. Then, early one cold January morning, Lucretia's nightmares became real. Let's turn the page. There was a terrible pounding on the front door. Lucretia heard the men shouting to be let in. She trembled. Lucretia heard her mother scream, and she jumped out of bed. As soon as her feet touched the cold wood floor, she heard the tremendous bang. A gunshot. "Oh, dear, that man was from Kentucky. Slave catchers are after us." You see, Lucretia Crosswhite was born a slave child in Kentucky. She belonged to the Giltner family. When her father learned that the Giltners planned to sell his children, they ran away. They traveled across Indiana to Michigan. The family used the Underground Railroad. People fed them and led them to hiding places. Finally, the Crosswhites arrived in Marshall, Michigan. After a while, they bought a small home. They wanted to live happy. But now the slave catchers had come. Lucretia and her brothers and sisters hugged each other. They heard the men shouting and banging on the door. Lucretia began to cry. Would they ever see each other again? She jumped when she heard an awful crash and wood splintering. The door, it had been broken down. Let's turn the page. One neighbor heard the gunshot. He jumped on his horse to spread the warning. Moses Patterson rode through Marshall shouting, "Slave catchers at Crosswhites, come quick, come help." Even though it was early and cold, people came to the Crosswhite home. The deputy sheriff was with the slave catchers. He told the people the men from Kentucky had papers. Those papers showed that they could take the Crosswhites. Some men started to argue with the deputy. They reminded him that slavery was against the law in Michigan. They told the deputy he did not have to help the slave catchers. Then the deputy spoke loudly. "If you men and women do not get out of my way, I will arrest you." By this time, many more people crowded around. Some of the crowds pressed against the deputy and slowly pushed him against the wall. The deputy was about to speak again. He carefully looked at the crowd. He saw 100 or maybe 200 people by now. The deputy thought for a minute. He said, "You men from Kentucky must come with me to my office. Leave this family alone." One of the slave catchers took out a little notebook and pencil. "I want your names. Tell me who you are. I want to know who will not let us have our property." The people of the crowd spoke out. One man said, "Charles T. Gorham," and write it in capital letters. "I am Oliver Cromwell Comstock, Jr. Take it down in full so my father will not be held responsible for what I do," said another. Now another people gladly shouted out their names. The deputy pulled one of the slave catcher's coat. "Hurry now. Let us leave while we still can." Let's turn the page. The crowd shouted, "Arrest them, deputy!" They broke into the man's home. "Look, one of them has a pistol. Put them in jail." The slave catchers left with the deputy sheriff. Now the Crosswhites quickly packed their things. A man took them to his mill. Later, they were taken in a wagon to Jackson. The wagon stopped at the train station. Lucretia and her family huddled with a few things they brought with them. Soon, they were on a train to Detroit. It was not long before Lucretia, her parents, brothers, and sisters were on a boat. They crossed the Detroit River going into Canada. Lucretia took a long look back at Michigan. She wondered if they would ever come back. She wondered if the slave catchers could find them in Canada. How far must they run to be free? The next year, the men from Kentucky came back to Michigan. This time, they went to court. They sued the people who had given me their names. They demanded $1,925 in payment for the Crosswhite family. That was a lot of money then, much more than the cost of a nice house. Finally, the Kentuckians won. The people who gave their names were very, very worried. But others from Michigan raised the money to help pay the cost. How does the story end? Well, no slave catchers went to Canada after the Crosswhites. Escaped slaves were protected in that country. Several years later, after some time, the Crosswhites came back to Marshall. Adam Crosswhite died in 1878 and is buried in the Marshall Cemetery. Some relatives of the Crosswhites still live there in Michigan today. Let's turn the page. The events with the Crosswhite family stirred up trouble in other places. This is one reason new national laws were passed. These laws were called the Fugitive Slave Laws. They made it more dangerous to help escape slaves or fugitives. People helping them could face big fines or even jail time. Go ahead and answer your exit ticket, reread, re-listen, and do your best.